Well, instead of a discounted price on the shares, what if I just gave shares? What if I transferred or did transfers of shares to the employees? You know, just basically gave them to them. They didn't have to really put any money in, or maybe I gave them the option to buy some, right? Give them a little bit of an incentive. Well, what we want to do is, again, we want to take a look at the codification, and let me make this a little bit bigger just so we can see it better. And again, we're in expenses, we're looking at compensation, and we're looking at stock compensation. And let's take a look at kind of the overall. This is really where we want to spend our time, looking at the overall. And yes, status, overview, objectives, scope exceptions, but let's take a look at the recognition. So we're in 718-10-25. And these are the things that we want to be focused on, right? So we're going to be looking at how we recognize, what's the recognition principle for share-based payment transactions. How do we determine the grant date? Is it a liability or is it truly an equity transaction? Right? And the key on this here is whether or not there's the ability to go to cash. That the employee, instead of owning the equity, can get cash right away or pretty soon thereafter. And there's things called puttable shares. You know, again, we're just looking at the contract to see, is there anything in there that might suggest that they're not actually getting equity long term, but they're actually getting cash payments. We want to look at what are the conditions of earning this award, and to a lesser degree, what are the payroll taxes. I'm not that interested in the payroll taxes as much as I am interested in these other 4 items, A through D. So go and take a look at these things. Right? And again, recognition is for services or for something that's been performed. Right? Just like any other, we've incurred an expense when we hand over this contract, we hand over this award. And we need to recognize those payments, we need to recognize those future potential payments in equity as compensation expense at that point in time, because it's likely that we're not paying you cash, we're giving you an equity instrument in lieu of cash. Well, if I was going to pay you cash, then I would recognize an expense. Well, we do the exact same thing here. So it's just a matter of when's the grant date, because that's when we have to start the clock and start recognizing things. You know, figure out whether or not it's a liability or equity, and then think about what are the things that are triggering it. And we'll kind of start with this idea of service conditions. Most of that's time-based, and most of these awards you'll see are time-based, but they could also be awards that if you hit a particular market price, then the award is earned. Or if we get net income to equal X, then from a performance standpoint, the award is earned. So you always have to look and see what is going to be the trigger for whether or not the award is earned. So let's take a look and just jot down some notes here of what we're thinking about. So we are in, so this is just general stock awards, right? This is general stock awards. And we're in ASC 718-10-25, right? That's our literature reference. Okay? So on that grant date, on the not the day that I write the contract, but on the grant date, the date that it actually goes live, right? That's when the earnings starts occurring. So on the grant date, so grant date is important. We determine the fair value of the equity, the fair value of the contract, right? What's the fair value of what I am giving up? Because if this was important and I was giving it in cash, we'd know what the fair value of the cash is. Here we're giving you shares of stock. What's the fair value at the grant date? And we'll talk about the three different types of stock transfers we can do here. Right? So if we're thinking about this from a service perspective, we need to determine what the service period is. Or if it's a performance trigger, if you will. What's the performance trigger? Or if it's a market trigger. When I say trigger, right, a service period is defined as you're going to work here for 4 years, then each year you get some more of these shares. You'll now own them outright. Whereas a performance trigger is once you hit this item, now you own the shares. They're yours to keep forever and ever and ever. If you don't hit the performance trigger, you don't get it. Same thing with a market trigger. There still may be restrictions around these two to force the employee to stay longer, right? The goal is we're giving you these shares because we want you to stay with the organization. We think there's something good about you as a person. And so if it's a service period, it might be 3-4 years. We want you to keep working here for 3 or 4 years before you fully earn your equity. Even with a performance trigger, you may earn that performance in the first 2 years, but it may still stay restricted for another couple of years after because we want you to stay a couple more years. Same thing with a market trigger. So we got to determine what is the period, performance, the market trigger. Then we have to allocate the fair value of the instrument, of the contract, over whatever is the requisite trigger, right? And so with performance triggers and market triggers, we have to build in, well, what's the probability, right? If there's 0 probability, we may not get to actually recognize the fair value of any of this stuff. But as the probability increases, that also increases our compensation expense. So we have to allocate the fair value of the contract. We're going to keep it simple. We're going to stay away from these market and performance triggers and really think about this from a time perspective for simplicity's sake. So we're going to allocate the fair value of the contract over the service period. If you have a performance trigger or market trigger, then you just need to take a look at that contract and go to the literature, because guess what? It's in the literature on how you handle these two. For this class, we're just going to kind of stick with this service period idea. If there are any probability concerns, and really we're thinking about the probability of forfeiture. The employee forfeiting this particular award. Why would they forfeit it? Maybe they leave the company. Automatically forfeiture. Or they violate their employment contract and they have a breach of contract. Could call for forfeiture. So you have to build in the probability of forfeiture into the compensation expense. And then, of course, if any of this, any of this stuff, we'd have to figure out whether or not we are in the equity section or if this is a liability. That all depends on whether or not the contract calls for these shares to be put back to us and we've got to give cash, or that there's a way that they can immediately just, instead of taking back the shares, they can immediately just get cash instead. If there's any way, shape, or form that there's cash involved in a short amount of time, your judgment, what do you believe is a short amount of time, then all of this stuff gets classified as a liability versus classified as equity.